tourist attraction. His voice carried that particular cruelty of youth combined with privilege, sharp, mocking, and completely unaware of its own ignorance. The afternoon heat had begun to press down on the palace grounds, but Anderson's posture remained perfect. His eyes stayed fixed forward, though decades of military training had made him acutely aware of Carter's every movement. The boy's expensive shoes scuffed against the courtyard stones as he continued his taunting circuit. "I bet it's because you couldn't make it in the real military," Carter continued, warming to his theme. "That's it, isn't it? Had to settle for playing dress-up." He leaned in closer, his silk shirt rustling. "Or maybe you just like wearing fancy costumes. The hat's a bit much, though, don't you think?" Mr. Peterson made another weak attempt at intervention. "Carter, these guards are actually active duty." "Active duty? What?" Carter spun around, his face flushed with the excitement of having an audience. "Standing still? Looking pretty for Instagram?" He turned back to Anderson, emboldened by what he mistook for weakness. "Come on, at least blink or something. Show us you're not just a really expensive mannequin." A small group of American tourists had edged away, embarrassment clear on their faces, but Carter was too focused on his performance to notice. He moved even closer to Anderson, close enough that the guard could smell the remnants of the boy's expensive lunch at the Ritz. "You know what I think?" Carter's voice dropped to a stage whisper. "I think you're just afraid. Afraid to move, afraid to speak up, afraid to be real." His words carried the confidence of someone who had never faced actual consequences, who had never learned the difference between courage and cruelty. The sun caught Anderson's medals, decorations earned in battles Carter couldn't imagine, in places his privileged world had never touched. But the boy saw only shiny objects, more costume pieces to mock. "Nice pins you've got there," Carter sneered, his face inches from the medals. "Did they come with the outfit, or did you have to buy them separately?" He reached out as if to touch one, then pulled back with an exaggerated laugh. "Oops, almost forgot. We're not supposed to touch the displays." An elderly man wearing a veteran's pin stepped forward, his face tight with controlled anger. "Young man, those medals were earned in the gift shop?" Carter cut him off with the casual dismissal of someone who had never been taught to respect his elders. "Come on, this whole thing is just a show, and not even a good one." He turned back to Anderson, his voice taking on an ugly edge. "At least the guards at Disney World talk back." The tension in the courtyard had become palpable. Parents guided their children away, while other tourists watched with a mix of fascination and horror. But Carter, cushioned by 18 years of getting his way, remained oblivious to the atmosphere he was creating. "Still nothing?" Carter's voice had taken on a harder edge, his privileged confidence cracking in the face of Anderson's unwavering discipline. "You know, in my world, when someone ignores you, there are consequences." The last word rolled off his tongue with unpracticed menace, a child's imitation of authority he'd seen but never understood. His fingers tugged at his silk collar, a nervous gesture that betrayed his growing frustration. Every second of being ignored seemed to chip away at 18 years of entitled certainty. The afternoon sun caught the brass buttons of Anderson's uniform as Carter shifted his weight, his expensive tennis shoes scraping against the courtyard stones. Years of military service had taught Anderson to read body language, the subtle tells that preceded violence. He could see it building in the boy's stance, in the way his manicured hands clenched and unclenched, in the growing flush of frustrated entitlement across his young face. Even the way Carter's shoulders tensed reminded Anderson of countless confrontations he'd witnessed, though usually from more dangerous opponents than this privileged teenager. A couple of German tourists whispered to each other, slowly backing away as they sensed the building tension. Their cameras lowered, the atmosphere no longer suitable for holiday snapshots. Even the pigeons seemed to sense the shift, taking wing from their perches on nearby statues. "I said," Carter's voice rose sharply, cracking slightly on the last word, "there are consequences." His right foot drew back slightly, his body telegraphing his intentions with all the subtlety of someone who had never been in a real fight. "Maybe you need a lesson in manners. When someone talks to you, you're supposed to answer." The words tumbled out in a rush. each one higher pitched than the last, his composure unraveling like a cheap sweater. Mr. Peterson's face had gone pale, his years of experience as a tutor having taught him to recognize the moments when his charge's temper crossed dangerous lines. "Carter, don't!" His warning carried all the authority of a paper shield against a tidal wave. But Carter was already in motion. His leg swung forward in what he imagined was a powerful kick aimed at Anderson's knee. Reality, however, had different plans for the entitled teenager who had never learned the physics of actual combat. His designer genes, too tight for any practical movement, restricted his kick even before it began. His Italian leather belt caught the sunlight as his body twisted awkwardly, everything about his stance wrong in ways that would have made any martial arts instructor wince. The moment stretched like pulled taffy, each fraction of a second burning itself into the memories of every witness. Carter's designer shoe sliced through the air with all the precision of a drunk butterfly, the white leather soon to be scuffed beyond the help of any premium cleaning service. His balance, already compromised by anger and inexperience, shifted exactly wrong. The kick that was supposed to bring the guard to his knees instead twisted Carter's own ankle at an angle that nature never intended. Time seemed to slow, allowing everyone to witness each excruciating detail of karma in action. Carter's confident smirk transformed into wide-eyed realization, then blossoming panic as he felt his designer shoe catch against the ancient stones. His ankle rolled with the graceless inevitability of someone discovering far too late that actions have consequences, that no amount of family money can prevent. The sound that followed wasn't the solid impact Carter had imagined. Instead, it was a complicated symphony of consequences. The soft scrape of his shoe barely brushing Anderson's uniform, the sharp crack of his ankle twisting, and the high-pitched yelp of sudden pain that escaped his throat as his whole world tilted sideways. The noise echoed off the palace walls, a perfect acoustic reminder that privilege doesn't protect against physics. Carter hit the ground with all the grace of his privileged upbringing, which was to say, none at all. His silk shirt, probably worth more than a week's salary for most people present, gathered dust from the courtyard stones as he clutched at his ankle. His face transformed from arrogant confidence to shocked disbelief to pure, unadulterated pain, each expression a more honest version of the last. The gold chain around his neck, a recent birthday gift he'd bragged about earlier, tangled uncomfortably against his throat as he curled inward. Ow! Oh God, ow! The carefully cultivated image of sophisticated rebellion shattered like fine china as Carter curled around his injured ankle. Tears, real ones, not the kind he used to get his way at home, sprang to his eyes, smearing the designer sunglasses that had fallen askew on his face. My ankle, I think it's broken. His voice had lost all its previous bravado, reduced to the scared whimper of a boy who had just learned that actions have physical consequences. His perfectly manicured nails, fresh from a morning spa treatment, scraped uselessly against the stones. The crowd had drawn back instinctively, creating a circle around the fallen teenager. Parents pulled their children closer, using the moment as an impromptu lesson about respect and consequences. A few phones had appeared to record the moment, but their owners quickly lowered them, something about the scene too raw, too human for casual entertainment. Even the most hardened cynics in the crowd found no pleasure in watching privilege meet reality with such painful clarity. "Somebody help!" Carter's voice cracked, pain stripping away years of entitled behavior to reveal the scared teenager beneath. His hands fluttered uselessly around his ankle, manicured nails scraping against designer socks as if trying to claw the pain away. The Italian leather of his belt creaked as he twisted, trying to find a position that hurt less. "Dad's going to kill me. Oh God, it hurts!" His sunglasses clattered to the ground, revealing eyes wide with a fear no amount of money had ever prepared him for. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but to someone who had never experienced real physical pain, whose worst hurts had been emotional and quickly soothed with money or privilege, it was an apocalypse of agony. Carter's face had gone from flushed with anger to pale with shock, his carefully styled hair now mussed with sweat and dust from the courtyard stones. His right hand kept reaching for his phone, then pulling back as if unsure whether to call his father or simply curl into a ball and wish the world away. It was then that guard James Anderson did something that made the crowd draw a collective breath. With the same precision that marked his every movement, he broke his stance. The ceremonial rifle was secured in one fluid motion as he stepped toward the fallen teenager, not with anger or satisfaction, but with the measured concern of a professional soldier. "Stay still, son." Anderson's voice carried the quiet authority of command, though gentler than he might use on the battlefield. "Let me have a look at that ankle." His movements were precise and controlled as he knelt beside Carter, white-gloved hands a stark contrast against the boy's dusty designer clothes. Carter blinked through his tears, confusion momentarily overwhelming his pain. The statue he'd been mocking was suddenly very much alive, and more than that, he was helping. But I tried to," his voice hitched with a mixture of pain and bewilderment. "Doing my job doesn't mean I'll leave someone injured," Anderson replied matter-of-factly, his trained eyes assessing the ankle. "Even if that someone made some poor choices." His hands moved with professional efficiency, checking for serious damage. "It's a bad sprain, but I don't believe anything's broken. Still, you'll need proper medical attention." The crowd watched in respectful silence as Anderson signaled to a palace guard nearby. His next actions demonstrated why the Queen's Guard are soldiers first, ceremonial guards second. With careful but confident movements, he helped Carter into a sitting position that would keep weight off the injured ankle. "I don't understand." Carter winced, his voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Why are you helping me? I was trying to, I was being a right proper prat, if you'll pardon my saying so." Anderson finished for him, though there was no malice in his tone. His hands were already fashioning a makeshift support for the ankle, using his own ceremonial sash, an item that would take hours to replace and polish. "Leaving someone in pain isn't part of any military training I've received." Mr. Peterson had finally found his courage and hurried forward. "Should we call an ambulance?" "Palace medical team's already on their way," Anderson assured him, not looking up from his work. "They'll take good care of him." His movements were precise as he secured the temporary support. "Though I suspect this young man's pride might take longer to heal than his ankle." Carter's face flushed, but this time with shame rather than anger. The guard's quiet competence, his unhesitating assistance despite the previous abuse, was doing what years of expensive education had failed to do, teaching him about real dignity and strength. "I'm sorry," Carter whispered, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. I didn't think." "No, you didn't," Anderson agreed calmly. "But thinking usually comes after consequences, in my experience." He adjusted the makeshift support with practiced care. "The uniform you are mocking, every soldier wearing it has trained extensively in combat medicine. The toy soldier you thought you saw, he's treated wounds under heavy fire, helped evacuate civilians from combat zones, and yes, occasionally stands very still while tourists take photos." The palace medical team was approaching now, their kit bags at the ready. Anderson gave them a professional nod before turning back to Carter. "The medals you laughed at, each one represents lives saved, duties fulfilled, sacrifices made. We stand guard not because we can't do anything else, but because we've done enough to earn the right to guard what matters." Carter's eyes dropped to the ceremonial sash now supporting his ankle, an item he'd been mocking minutes earlier, now being sacrificed to ease his pain. The irony wasn't lost on him, and for perhaps the first time in his 18 years, he felt truly small. "The medical team will take good care of you," Anderson said, standing with military precision. "But before I return to my post, remember this. True strength isn't in how hard you can kick. It's in knowing when to help someone who tried to kick you." As the medical team began their work, Anderson remained nearby, his presence now carrying a different kind of authority, not the ceremonial stillness of before, but the active command of a soldier ensuring a situation was properly handled. "This might hurt a bit," one of the medics warned as they examined Carter's ankle. The teenager bit his lip, trying to hold back another whimper. His expensive shirt was ruined, his perfectly styled hair now damp with sweat, but somehow those details seemed terribly unimportant. "The thing about standing guard," Anderson spoke again, his voice pitched for Carter's ears though others could hear, is that it teaches you patience, teaches you that there's more to strength than movement, more to power than action. He paused as the medics worked, noting how Carter winced. It teaches you to think before you act. Carter looked up, his face a mixture of pain and dawning understanding. Nobody ever. He struggled to find the words. Everyone usually just does what I want. And that, Anderson replied quietly, is perhaps the greatest disservice they've done you. His words carried no judgment, just the simple weight of truth. In the military, we learned quickly that rank and privilege mean nothing to bullets or bombs. Nature works the same way. Physics doesn't care about your family name or bank account. The medics were wrapping Carter's ankle now, their movements professional and efficient. Mr. Peterson hovered nearby, his earlier timidity replaced by genuine concern for his charge. The crowd had begun to disperse, though many lingered, sensing they were witnessing something important. When I first joined the military, Anderson continued, his voice taking on a teaching tone that commanded attention, I thought I knew everything. First day of training, I learned differently. Not from getting yelled at, not from push-ups or drills, but from a simple truth. The uniform doesn't make the soldier. The soldier honors the uniform. Carter nodded slightly, understanding beginning to penetrate the fog of pain and embarrassment. Like how you helped me, even after I was such a... He trailed off, unable to find a word bad enough. The uniform represents something greater than any individual, Anderson explained. When you mocked it, you weren't just insulting me. You were disrespecting every soldier who's ever worn it, every sacrifice it represents, every principle it stands for. He adjusted his stance, parade ground perfect even in this teaching moment. But responding to disrespect with neglect would dishonor it just as much. The medical team had finished their initial treatment. We'll need to get him to proper facilities for an X-ray, one reported. It's likely just a severe sprain, but better to be certain. Carter started to struggle to his feet, but Anderson's hand on his shoulder kept him seated. Patience, son. Another lesson we learn early. Rushing a bad situation only makes it worse. He nodded to the medics who were preparing a wheelchair. Accept help when it's offered. There's no weakness in that. I've never needed help before, Carter admitted quietly, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Or maybe I just never realized I did. Understanding that is worth more than any tutor's fee, Anderson replied, helping Carter carefully into the wheelchair. The strongest men I've known were those who understood their limitations, who knew when to stand firm and when to accept assistance. As the medical team prepared to transport him, Carter looked up at Anderson with new eyes, not seeing a ceremonial guard or a tourist attraction, but a soldier, a teacher, a man who demonstrated more strength through compassion than any amount of wealth or privilege could buy. Thank you, Carter said softly, the words carrying the weight of a lesson learned the hard way. Not just for this, he gestured at his wrapped ankle, but for showing me what real strength looks like. As the medical team began to wheel Carter away, Anderson's voice carried one final message. Remember this moment, son. Not the pain or the embarrassment, but the lesson. Every guard standing here has earned their place through years of service, discipline, and sacrifice. The stillness you see isn't weakness, it's strength under perfect control. Carter nodded, his eyes showing a maturity that hadn't been there an hour ago. The wheelchair moved smoothly across the courtyard, taking him past the same tourists he'd shouldered through earlier. But now, instead of arrogant dismissal, his face showed something new, awareness, perhaps even the first glimmer of respect. Mr. Peterson hurried alongside, already on his phone. Yes, Mrs. Blake? Carter's had a bit of an accident. No, Mom, the guard was actually most helpful. His voice faded as they moved toward the medical facilities. Anderson watched them go, his bearing still perfect despite having broken protocol to help. The crowd that remained looked at him differently now. Not as a tourist attraction, but as what he truly was. A soldier whose commitment to duty included not just standing guard, but embodying the principles of service and compassion his uniform represented. With the same precision that marked his every movement, Anderson returned to his post. His ceremonial sash was gone, sacrificed to help the very person who had mocked it, but somehow its absence made his uniform seem even more dignified. Each metal gleamed in the late afternoon sun, their significance no longer just ceremonial but proven through actions. As he resumed his watch, a curious thing happened. Tourists who approached now did so with noticeable respect. Parents quietly explained to their children not just what the guard was, but what he represented. The story of what had transpired spread through the crowd in hushed whispers, each retelling, reinforcing the lesson that true authority comes not from power or privilege, but from character and compassion. From the palace medical facility, Carter watched through a window as Anderson stood at his post, exactly as he had before. But now, the teenager saw something different. Not a statue, not a tourist attraction, but a living embodiment of principles he was only beginning to understand. His ankle throbbed, but the pain seemed to be teaching him something his privileged upbringing never had. Respect isn't commanded through money or force. It's earned through actions and character. As the sun began its descent over Buckingham Palace, Guard James Anderson continued his watch, standing as he always had, a guardian not just of gates and walls, but of values that no amount of wealth could buy, and no amount of arrogance could diminish.